All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today, we are talking to repeat guest and one of my favorite human beings, the one and the only Brian McLaren. So, Brian, welcome back to the show. It's always an honor.
Well, I have good memories of being with you in the past and great to be with you again. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you. So, you have a new book coming out, or by the time that this releases, the book will already be out. But the book is called Do I Stay Christian? And is subtitled A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned. And so maybe a good place to start is tell us a little bit about the book, because your previous book is called Faith After Doubt. Now this one's kind of posing the question, do I even stay Christian? So are the two similar? Are they different? Does one feed off the other? Give us the lay of the land.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Actually, the two books kind of evolved together in my mind, and here's why. In Faith After Doubt, I try to synthesize a lot of the best research out there on stages of development. And I have a simple model for faith development that's compiles a lot of other people's creative work. And the four stages are simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. So simplicity, where a lot of people begin, they believe what they're told, they believe what authority figures tell them. And it's all very literal and very dualistic, us, them, in, out, good, bad. And then a lot of people stay in stage one their whole life and then grow. But some people move into stage two, complexity, which is more pragmatic, where you realize, shoot, I thought our group was the only group that was right, but those folks think they're right. I got to get along with them. So we learn how to navigate a more complex world.
Sure.
And then stage three is perplexity. And perplexity is when we start saying, hey, those people who made it sound so simple, they weren't right. And so now we have to go back and in many ways challenge and question the authority figures that really formed our childhood faith. And some people stay in stage three their whole life. But then more and more people, I think, are moving into stage four that I call harmony, which is an integration of the first three stages, where we develop the ability to say, hey, people are where they are. And we see that, in a sense, each of these four stages builds on the other. So that was the big framework for that book. Well, what I knew is that when people reach stage three or stage four, there are very, very many churches where they are no longer welcome.
That's right.
And it creates a real crisis for people. And they just wonder, is there really room for me to stay Christian? So I knew this was a big question. And it's been a big issue for me, literally since I was, probably in sixth grade or something, when I started having deep questions and doubts myself. And I remember thinking, well, Christianity is what it is. And if I question anything, I guess I won't be a Christian as soon as I turn 18. So it's been part of my own life too.
Sure. Now, would you say that is stage 3 and 4, just to kind of put it in context for listeners, would stage 3 be like deconstruction, stage 4 kind of reconstruction?
Yes, except that I think a lot of times when people talk about deconstruction and reconstruction, they assume that reconstruction just means picking up the pieces and putting them together in maybe a different way, or unscrewing your, inerrancy of scripture light bulb and putting in an LED one instead,
Right.
But I think if we understand that reconstruction isn't just another version of the old thing, that's more of a stage 2 thing. Stage 2 is more involved with tinkering with and trying to perfect your theological system. I think stage 4 harmony is more about realizing, a way to say it is, it's not necessarily just changing your beliefs, but it is changing how you hold your beliefs. So,
yeah. I think that's a good point, because I think a lot of times we, like you said, people tend to think that deconstruction is like you knock it all down like a Lego tower, but now you're going to take the Lego pieces and just put it back in a little bit different order. But in reality, some of those pieces, you might just throw them aside completely and not even use them anymore. But I think the bigger piece is, deconstruction is something I found that makes room for everything. Like it's just holding ideas more loosely, because I know for myself, like I I reached out to you. You're one of the first people I reached out to when I started to like deconstruct and ask questions. But I was still looking for that certainty because I'm like, oh my goodness, like
Yes.
I'm losing hold of this certainty. Like now I need to become certain about something else, or I feel like I'm going to
Yes.
just unravel. But now I'm in this place where I don't know. I'm just comfortable with the answer. I don't really know. I'm just going to hold loosely to it and trust that somehow it works out in the end.
Certainty is a good way to frame those four stages, because you could say in simplicity, you have certainty and it's very simple. and in complexity, you're still after certainty, but you're willing to have some fine print,
That's
and
right.
it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of footnotes,
Right.
a more complex certainty. Stage 3, you've lost your certainty and you're really angry about it.
Right.
And you're angry at those people who ever gave you certainty.
Right.
And you're hurt and disappointed. And then I think stage 4 involves the ability to say, you know what, certainty wasn't all it was cracked up to be. There are a lot of downsides to certainty. And I need to live with the right kind of confidence, but that's different than certainty. And in some ways, I think for people like you and me of faith, and especially Christian faith, it means redefining faith as not adherence to a list of beliefs that we pretend we're certain about, or that we maybe sincerely feel certain about. But no, faith is the way that we live in a world where certainty is a luxury that isn't as easy to come by as people used to think.
That's right. That's right. That's a excellent way to put it, which that alone could set us down a couple of rabbit holes.
That's right.
All right. So your book is divided into 3 sections or 3 parts. And just for our listeners, part 1 is kind of gives 10 reasons to not stay Christian. Then part 2 gives us 10 reasons to stay Christian. Then part 3 is kind of like, regardless of whether we stay or we leave, how do we move forward as decent and good human beings? So maybe let's take it like piece by piece, and we'll see how far we're able to get. But let's start with part 1. I got to say that when I reached the end of chapter 10, I was ready to throw in the towel on the whole thing, Brian. I was thinking to myself, part 2 better be really good, because I'm about ready to burn this thing completely to the ground, because you present us with a lot of really good reasons as to why, frankly, Christianity can just be abandoned and left behind. So I'm wondering, before we move into that second piece, which one of those 10 reasons is the one that has like kept you up the most at night? Like, which one of those 10 things has really kind of pushed you to the brink of maybe staying here with this whole thing isn't really worth it?
Well, gosh, that's hard. Maybe I'll just, could I just read the 10, and then
Please.
as I reread them, maybe I'll come up with an answer. But the first is because Christianity has been vicious to its mother, and that's about anti-Semitism. And I'll be honest, that's one of the ones early on when I learned about the history of Christian anti-Semitism. It really disturbed me. I especially felt, why has this been kept a secret from me?
Yes. You don't hear that. You don't hear the history. You don't hear that stuff.
Oh my gosh. Just yesterday, I learned something new. There was a headline yesterday that the Church of England just apologized because in the 12th century, they banished all the Jews from England. I never even knew that.
No idea.
I think about 300 years, Jews were banished from England.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyhow, it's a big deal. And of course, there still are these anti-Semitic elements, overt and covert, that keep cropping up. Because I don't think Christianity has faced its history. Because of Christianity's suppression of dissent, that has to do with the way Christians treat their fellow Christians who differ on doctrine or practice or something. Third is because of Christianity's high global death toll and life toll. That's the combination of the Crusades and colonialism, the violent, the actually militaristic, violent history of Christianity. Again, I learned about colonialism, but I never learned the whole story.
Never. Yeah.
and that of course includes all the history of slavery.
Mhm.
Um, uh, uh, and so many people have no idea how deeply Christian theology was used to support slavery in the US and elsewhere. Chapter 4 is because of Christianity's loyal company men. This is where I try to deal with the kind of inner dynamics of institutionalism. And it has a lot of people have suffered because of this, especially women, I think, especially gay people,
Yeah.
but even people who work in the Christian industry often experience some of its dark side. Fifth chapter is because of Christianity's real master, which I talk about the power of money in the Christian world, because of White Christian Old Boys Network, and this is the whole issue of white patriarchy, which sort of combines whiteness and patriarchy. Chapter 7 is because Christianity is stuck. This deals with this toxic theology. 8th, because Christianity is a failed religion. This is about the lack of transformation. 9, because of Christianity's great wall of bias, how it's intellectualism, how Christian intellectuals use their intellect to defend what they're already required to believe, but there is so little freedom of inquiry. And then chapter 10, because it has to do with demographics, because more and more young people are leaving, and who wants to be left with, kind of the aging cohort of who are holding on to some past understanding of the world. And I would say all 10 at different times, now that I've reviewed them, have been probably the biggest one. And I think I've in some ways come to terms with that all 10 of them are there, they're part of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And I've also think I've come to terms with the fact that that the only way forward is whether you leave or stay, we've got to face reality, and that's those 10 are part of our reality.
Yeah, because I think a lot, like you said, I mean, a lot of people just are unaware that that's the reality. And I think that was for me, even reading your book, I was like, I didn't know that. Like there's even things now, like I'm learning that I'm just like, why was I in the dark about all this? Why was I given this whitewashed history of our faith? Like even slavery, like you're just talking about slavery. Like I was just honestly, like I was just really told that like, yes, slaves had it really bad, but a lot of them had it really good, because they had, slave owners who were Christians, and Christians are good people. And like, that's just what I was told. I was like, oh, all right, but then I'm reading all this stuff now from all these different people and all these different scholars and thinkers and Black writers. And I'm just like, holy smokes, like how did I not know that this is part of my history?
In fact, early in the book, I use an example that I think was shocking the first, I felt this might be really shocking to people the first time I said it out loud, but now I think it's so realistic. And that is, I said, what would it be like to be a young kid who grows up in this super loving family where it's just one of the happiest families you could imagine. And then the kid turns 14 and discovers that his family's part of something called the mafia, and they're close and they're loving and they're good to each other. But then he finds out, unless you keep the family secrets and join the family business, really bad things are going to happen to you.
Yeah, right. It's exactly the way it is. It's a perfect illustration. For me, I think the one that really kind of hit home for me was in chapter 9, which is the Great Wall of Bias. And just that whole idea that you are forbidden to believe, read, sometimes even think outside of these predetermined theological boxes. And I can remember as I was reading the chapter, I was remembering this event in my life. And I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I was sitting in a doctoral class at my very evangelical seminary, and I was about a year away from graduating. And this podcast, I didn't start it yet, but it was kind of swirling around in my heart because I was asking a lot of questions, and I was wrestling with a lot of things. I had come to listen to you speak at a church in New Jersey. I don't know if you remember that, in Ridgewood, that big Presbyterian church.
Yes.
You were there speaking about, I think it was the Great Spiritual Migration book. But I was also reading all of Rob Bell's books again. I had all those books off my shelf, and my my evangelical faith was like unraveling at a rapid
Yes.
pace. And
Yes.
since I like to create stuff, that's how I process things like blog posts, images, things like that. I would post a lot of the things I was reading on Facebook and other places on social media. I'll never forget, it was right before the class was about to begin in school. And it was maybe like 10 minutes. I was sitting at my desk getting all my stuff ready. And a very prominent figure in the seminary came into the room. He was talking to a group of students. I wasn't part of the conversation. He was talking to them. And he looked over at me, like turned away from the group and said, "Hey, Glenn, you better stop posting all that Rob Bell stuff on your Facebook page, or people are going to start to think really bad things about you." And something about that day and like that moment left me like so bothered,
Yeah.
even 5 years later. And it wasn't the first time someone questioned me, it wasn't the last time somebody questioned me, but the feeling of shame that I felt as
Yes.
I know this guy for like 20 years, and other
Yes.
students are now like literally laughing at me in a doctoral classroom.
Yes.
It's like this world where it's just closed off to these ideas that are outside of the box. You're not allowed to read things that are not okayed by the higher
Yes.
ups. You can't think differently. And it's just one of those moments that I really began to feel like maybe I just don't fit in this world
Yes.
anymore. Maybe I
Yes.
really do need to leave. It just brought a lot of questions to me about the topic of your book. Do I even stay here? Is it worth it?
Yes. And that story, Glenn, is such a perfect story because the first, the irony is that you're in a doctoral class, which is supposed to be about original thinking and critical thinking.
Thank you. Right.
And then, so the irony is that, no, this is just another place where you're scolded for original thinking and critical thinking.
Yeah.
But second, that you're in a religion that has like the book of Galatians that says it was for freedom Christ set you free. So it's all about freedom. And then you find out, hold it, you're not really free in this
Right.
religion, or are you?
That's right.
And we're left between this ideal that you find in the book of Galatians and the reality that you experience there. And this is part of the emotional pain. Do I believe in the ideal, or do I have to face this reality? And how do I grapple with that tension?
That's right. And that freedom piece is a huge piece because my wife went to the same college, which was part of the seminary. And one of the big phrases that's always thrown around is about, freedom in Christ, is about, finding your freedom in Christ, standing in your freedom in Christ, and being free to live your authentic self. And
Yeah.
when this event happened in that class, and other events happened as well, I remember I came home, I said to my wife, I said, "You know what? So all this talk about freedom that I've heard for the last 20 years of my life being involved with this particular institution, it's all about being free. They want you to be free, find your true self, but you're only free to operate within these boundaries." Like, it's like my daughter, like we say she's free to run outside in the backyard, but you got to stay inside the fence. That's where you're
Yes.
free to run. If you go in the woods, you're gonna get scolded. And that's the way it felt. Like, it felt like I was going into the woods with the Rob Bell
Yes.
books, going into the woods, coming to listen to you speak.
Yes.
And now I'm getting, you found your freedom, but you've gone a little bit too far with it. It's time to wheel it back in.
I don't need to know what that seminary was, but I'll make it. But
I'll tell
make
you
it,
after the recording.
yeah. But here's the interesting thing among Protestants.
Mhm.
We're always aware of how we're more free than the people who were more fundamentalist than we were.
Yeah.
And so there is this feeling like we broke off from them because they were too strict on this or this or this. So we really feel we're free, but we don't realize we just changed a little bit of the fine print, but we brought the same kind of fundamentalism along with us. It
That's
so
right.
often happens anyway.
Yeah, we like to have our fundamentalist ideas. We do.
Mm.
All right, so part two of the book, reasons to stay. So I guess we can go through the list again, but why are you still here? Like, what's one of the biggest reasons of the 10, and maybe it's a mix of all of them, but that you still suit up every morning as a Christian?
Well, maybe I'll just mention 3 of the 10
Sure.
reasons. They've all been significant for me, but the first is because leaving hurts allies and helps their opponents. And what I realize is that in every field of human endeavor, there are people struggling to make that field better.
Yep.
So it's happening in every denomination of Christianity. There are people working to make it better.
Yeah.
But it's also happening if you're a doctor or a nurse. Some hospitals take better care of people than others. And so there are people working to make the hospital and healthcare industry better. And there are people in Congress who really want to help people. And there are other people who are as corrupt and craven as anyone could imagine. So you realize that if you're working for good and you leave, you're taking support away from the other people are trying to be good. And in a sense, you're surrendering power to the people who are doing harm, knowingly or unknowingly.
Yeah.
And that to me is a big deal. I feel that. A lot more we could say about that if you want. But then in chapter 15 is because of our legendary founder. And in that chapter, I kind of try to do two things. I talk about how the real reason I'm still a Christian is because of Jesus. And I'm not just saying that because it's the right answer. It's actually
the Sunday school answer, right? Jesus is the answer to everything.
But the irony is it actually is my love for Jesus that causes me so much pain about the Christian religion, because it seems to have so little in common with him. It has everything in common with its own history of having arguments and debates about him. But actually, it seems in so many cases to be so unaware of what he actually said and did and taught, And the other thing I try to do in that chapter is to say, but when I say it's because of Jesus, that doesn't mean I have to be even a fundamentalist or a literalist in the way I read the Gospels. It's about the general impression you get of Jesus' life against the backdrop of his times that seems to me to set up a direction that I really sincerely want to be part of, and I don't want to abandon. So that's a really significant one. And then maybe the other, all of them, as I look at them on the table of contents are important. But chapter 18, because Christianity is changing for the worse and for the better. And I have this awareness that if I leave Christianity, I leave any voice to try to speak out against this, in my mind, extremely dangerous and harmful things the Christian religion is in the process of perpetrating right now on many, many levels we could talk about if you want. But on the other hand, I feel like, and I know this from the inside, this isn't just wishful thinking, the incredibly positive and constructive theological work and practical work that's being done right at this moment. As some people are doing some horrible things in the name of Christ, other people are doing absolutely breathtakingly beautiful things. And I want to be part of the beautiful things, and I want to be an insider who can speak out against the horrible things.
So pedal back to that, because you talked about how right now Christianity is kind of on the brink of doing or being part of some very dangerous things. But then on the flip side, there's people doing beautiful things. So let's start with the dangerous piece first, because that's one of the areas where like I get a lot of pushback, and I sometimes have trouble putting into words exactly what that means, because like a lot of people from my evangelical past, for family members, friends who are very much grounded in that way, as soon as you say something about the dangers of like the church's involvement with empire or whatever it might be, there's a significant pushback, like, you're just exaggerating the situation. So maybe talk to us about those dangerous pieces first.
Yeah, well, I'll be really frank, and I'm sorry for anybody this offends, but I want to also be honest and direct and frank. And the times, in my opinion, are too dangerous for anything less than honesty. So watching conservative Protestants and Catholics line up behind Donald Trump, who is obviously a liar, obviously a bigot, obviously has no respect for the equality and dignity of women, who is a craven, self-interested narcissist, who everyone who worked closely with him now are writing books about what a creep and jerk he is. And whether these folks who mobilize their Christian bases to support him, whether they do it because they actually love him, or because they just think he's useful for accomplishing their goals of getting a constitutional amendment or overturning Roe versus Wade or something like that. Um, Either way, to me, that is just despicable and dangerous. That's the kind of thing that leads to Hitler. That's the kind of thing that leads, well, it's what's happening in the Russian Orthodox Church with Putin. Putin can do the horrible things he's doing in Ukraine, and he's got leaders in the Russian Orthodox Church saluting him. So if Christianity is the largest religion in the world, and the vast majority of nuclear weapons are held by one or another nation with a strong Christian majority, they could literally blow up the world, and they would they're showing themselves willing to support authoritarian leaders who would press those buttons and plunge the world into destruction. So that's an obvious example. And if that sounds extreme and hysterical, I'm sorry, but I think it's a real danger. And in fact, books are coming out by former people working with Trump who talk about the things they were having to talk him back from. And then a second one that's less dramatic, but maybe even a greater threat. We have been pumping carbon into the atmosphere for a couple hundred years, and now the evidence is irrefutable that it's throwing our climate out of whack. And what's catastrophic about this is that when the temperature goes up, ice melts. Now, if people want to believe that ice doesn't really melt at 32 degrees, they can, but I think it melts at 32 degrees.
I think you're right.
And ice caps rise, sea levels rise, or ice caps melt, sea levels rise, cities are flooded. We think we have a problem of a few million Ukrainian refugees, and a couple of years ago, over 1 million Syrian refugees. Let's imagine hundreds of millions of people displaced from coastal cities around the world. Imagine the disruption. Then the economies of the world start to crash. And then imagine who's going to go to war against who, and who's going to, what totalitarian crazies are going to decide we might as well make our move now because the world is unstable. And then and suddenly you're imagining a complete collapse. You're measuring I don't want to encourage people to do this, but because it's painful. But on the other hand, I've done it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You imagine where climate change goes, and it is so catastrophic. And here's the thing: I cannot believe how many Christians are still in denial about it, first. And second, I can't believe how many Christians theologically just don't care, because they've been taught Jesus is coming back. Jesus is going to destroy the world. Maybe climate change is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And they even make it sound like you're being unfaithful to God to try to care for God's creation. So the destruction, that horror that can be done by Christians, and frankly, every single month that goes by that we keep electing people who don't get it, and Christians they're pressing the voting button that keeps this kind of inanity, absolute foolishness. The Bible has so much to say about wisdom, but what we're seeing is just absolute lack of wisdom, lack of foresight. And so unfortunately, instead of using the resources of our religion to make us more wise, we're using the resources of our religion to help us be fools. So that's a start.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, I'm thinking about just the climate change piece. I remember I had a conversation with somebody not that long ago on Facebook, and we were going back and forth about, the book of Revelation, and I was talking about, the real problems with the atmosphere, and the ice melting and the sea levels rising, and the various fires that we've seen like around the world, like in Australia and California. And the person literally said to me, well, like the Bible says that half the world will be destroyed by flood and half by fire. And this is what's supposed to happen. And I was like, I don't think that's what it means. And they said, well, I don't feel like I should have to fight for this, because my job is to spread the gospel. So when I die, I go to heaven. And then the other people who are saved as a result of my witness, go to heaven as well. Like, it's all about the next life and
Yes.
the fact that Jesus is going to come back any day now because all these things are happening. I'm like, I feel like it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's like we have this expectation, the church has the expectation that this certain thing is going to happen, and it's happening. And it's like, well, look, it's happening. It's just like the Bible said, but it's like, it's what we're making it happen
Yes,
because of our
exactly
lack
right.
of care. Like, how can
Exactly
people
right.
not see this, right?
Exactly right. So circling back then, that's why I'm really glad that you are doing this podcast and you are speaking, you are using your place in the Christian faith to try to help people move beyond that kind of very destructive and short-sighted and foolish and easily manipulated form of a form of Christianity. And it's why I try to stay. And but then on that's the negative side. On the positive
Sure.
side, I mean, these folks doing horrible things loudly, there are many other people doing wonderful things, and very often they're doing it quietly, but so many beautiful things too, from the work of the kinds of people you're having on your podcast, many of whom are scholars who work for decades to get theological breakthroughs and scholarly breakthroughs that then help us see, oh, there's another way to see this, there's another way to live that is, that's truly liberating. And I know these things are real because I know these people, and so I would never want to miss the chance to use whatever years I have left
Yeah.
to join them,
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think you're right. There's so many people doing such beautiful things. I do a lot of work with Alexander Shaya, and
Yes.
he is someone who, he clearly identifies as a Christian. He's very open about, I am a Christian. That is my
Yes.
story. And for the longest time, like, I'm wrestling with a lot of the things like you talk about in your book, thinking like, why are you so, thinking to myself, why are you so adamant about calling yourself a Christian? And he's really shown me that, like, the idea of Christianity that I have had in my life and that many people have is such a narrow view
Yes.
of the history of this faith. And once you just go back and go back and go back, you can see there's a lot of different roots, a lot of different branches that go off this way and that way. And he's just shown me that, like, this thing that you've been raised with is not the only thing. It's just it's just part of the bigger thing. It's a very small stream. And so, like, when you can tap into these other roots and you can see the expansiveness of the faith, and you can see there's other ways to do things, other ways to believe things. And I think that those voices are so important, because you mentioned in the book too that, like, as new generations are born and they're told the same old whitewashed story of Christianity, or the same, they're given the same tradition of Christianity, those other traditions start to get wiped out. Those other histories start to get wiped out. And I think it's so important that people like yourself, people like the Alexanders, stay in the faith to raise up these issues, to show people that this is the actual history. This is the actuality of the faith, that there's many different ways to believe and many different ways to think. And I think that that brings a lot of freedom to people who are young and who are rising up and growing up, wrestling with these very things we're talking about.
Well, thanks for saying that. Well said. And it strikes me, just so people know that we're not, we don't have an axe to grind here. It's not just the Christian religion that has this problem, right?
No.
Governments have this problem. So, they tell a whitewashed version of their history, and companies have a whitewashed version of their history. And so, this is a human problem. And this, to me, is at the end of the day where, if we believe that the Spirit of God is at work in the world somehow, inviting us to grow to greater maturity and Christ-likeness and so on, that, well, the Spirit's got to work with us where we are.
That's right.
and here we are in a mess.
That's right. Yeah, you talk in the book about, I think you say we tend to think there's two options. I've got to either defiantly leave, I got to walk out the door and throw a grenade behind me and blow the whole thing up, or I've got to compliantly stay. I've got to be like a yes man. But you said the third option is I can defiantly stay. That means I don't have to be it's not being disrespectful, but it's being respectful, being graceful, but refusing to stay within the boxes and
Yeah.
refusing to just be a yes man, but to actually bring these issues to the surface. And I think that for me, just that phrase made a lot of sense. Just, I'm going to defiantly stay here and I'm going to do the work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah. So good. All right. So last piece. Where do we go from here,
Yeah.
Ryan? So whatever people decide, whether they're gonna, I did on Facebook, I posted a quote from the book about that very thing, about defiantly staying, or all those the three different options.
Yeah.
A lot of people said, like, I just can't stay. I just
Yeah.
can't keep the label Christian. Other people said I can stay, I want to stay, but regardless of where they go, like, and I said to people, like, it doesn't, you got to do you. You know, I honor
Yeah.
your journey and whatever you're going to do, but as we leave, as we go forward, what's your advice for us?
Well, this is the thing. A lot of people, first of all, as you say, when I wrote this book, I didn't want this to be a book where I'm trying to persuade people to stay.
Right.
Because there are some people, for their own sake, they need to go. The sector of Christianity that they've experienced is destroying them. It's harming them. They need to be liberated from it. It's Egypt, and they need a Moses to give them permission to get out of there. You know?
Yep.
It's oppressing them. And so I'm not advocating that everybody stay, not only for that reason, but also I think a lot of Christians are unwilling to change unless they see enough people leave. And it's the people who are leaving who, in some ways, well, I think it's the people who stay, but don't stay compliantly. And it's the people who leave that wake them up to something's not working here, if they ever start to listen. And I hope many of those people will read this book. But here's the problem. So some people leave, but then they've still got to live a life. What kind of person are they going to be?
Right.
And so my sense as I wrote this book is, whether you stay or leave, the next day you have to wake up and say, how am I going to live? What kind of person do I want to be? And this, to me, whether you're, so let's say you're a happy Christian capitalist in America, and tomorrow you say, now I'm a happy non-Christian capitalist in America. We haven't solved all the problems yet. You still live in a world of climate change. You still live in a world of rising authoritarianism. You still live in a world where the rich control more wealth than they have at any time in my lifetime. And, you know, going way back before, back to practically the Gilded Age. So we live in this, and it's not just happening here, it's around the world. So we live in a world with lots of problems. We've got to wake up tomorrow, and what are we going to do about the world that we live in? And so that, to me, is the question that is good for everybody. And the irony is, I think if we answer that question right, whether we call ourselves Christian or not, we're going in a good direction.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think that's a good point. I think I've said that before. We have a closed Facebook group, and lots of different people in there with lots of different ideas. And one of the things I kind of throw out there a lot is, you know, we don't have to see eye to eye in order to move forward arm in arm. I think we can all agree. We can all agree that love is a good thing. We can all agree that there's problems in the world. There's people who are being oppressed. There's racism and all the different things. We don't have to see eye to eye on the theology stuff, but I think we can still form a human line. We can move.
I love it. I love it.
It makes a difference in the world.
I'm going to borrow that with your permission. I like that a lot.
Please do.
I like that. That says it well.
Please do.
So in that last,
go ahead. Sorry.
Well, in that last section, then I talk about 8 issues that I think are worth all of us grappling with, whether we decide to identify as Christian or not. That we're going to have to decide, for example, how we want to relate to people who are in a different place than we are. We have to decide, how do we want to relate to our own pain and our own disillusionment, and how are we going to experience healing in ourselves? We've got to decide how we want to live with the world, the earth, as we were talking about before, the the plants and the animals and the forests and all the rest. And at any rate, that I talk about that in that last section of the book.
Yeah, and that's so good. And I want to tell our listeners too, like, you said this earlier, that the book is not trying to persuade someone one way or the other. You're not trying to persuade people to not be Christian, because that's some of the feedback I saw going around online when people first saw the title of the book. Like, oh, here comes Brian McLaren gonna persuade people not to be Christian anymore. But that's not at all what that first section is. The second section, you're not trying to persuade people to stay. You're just really having an open, you're like tapping into the stuff that people are thinking, but maybe are too afraid to say. And you're allowing those things to come to the surface, and you're putting it out on the table, and you're telling people like it's okay to feel this stuff. And at the end of the day, like whatever it is that you feel, whatever decision you make, we can move forward. And I think that's what it is. That's what it's about.
Well, thanks. I'm happy that it struck you that way. The irony is, you could take a story in the Bible, like the children of Israel enslaved in Egypt, and they're unhappy. It's miserable having to make those stinking bricks, and working 7 days a week. And
right.
But you can easily imagine people saying, well, it must be God's will. We wouldn't be here if it weren't God's will. Like, you can imagine all kinds of theological justifications for saying we should stay.
Yeah.
And yet God was on the side of freedom. And I think that's the option that we have. Whether we leave or stay, we can be free or unfree. Right. And the freedom to be honest is a pretty important freedom. Right. So that's, whether we stay or go, I think we have to do it with integrity and honesty.
Amen. Preach it, Brian. Preach it. Well, hey, we're just about out of time, but again, this book is fantastic. Your work, thank you for your work, for your friendship, and thank you again for making time for me.
Well, every time I am with you or I see your posts on social media, I'm so grateful for you. It just feels like we're all in this work together, trying to pry some of the bolts loose so that the change that needs to happen can happen. So thanks.
Amen. And I will put all your links in the show notes, and I'm sure we'll bring you on for the 100th time. I don't know how many times we're up to now.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.